Hello, and thank you for joining us today for Frost & Sullivan's latest webinar from our Emerging Market Innovation Practice. Today's event is titled Brexit Impact on UK Economy and Industry. My name is Anna, and I oversee Frost & Sullivan's Growth, Innovation, and Leadership briefings. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a few quick notes. We will have some detailed slides on today's presentation. So there's a full screen feature available in the lower right-hand corner of your webinar player. You can safely share this briefing at any time via social media, email, or blog. Today's discussion will also be available on demand shortly after we finish. And don't forget to submit your questions throughout the session today. Our presenters are Neha Anna Thomas, Senior Economist, Kevin Kelly, Senior Consultant, Luca Raffaele, Head of Business and Financial Services, and Imogen Sujit, Director of Consulting EIA. With that, I would now like to hand the presentation over to Neha.
Thank you, Anna. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this presentation on Brexit and its impact. So on this particular slide that you see in front of you, I'd just like to outline what we have planned for you over the next 1 hour. So our presentation, we will start off with the Brexit timeline, of course, in terms of what can be expected over the next couple of months. And we will delve into the much talked about withdrawal agreement that's come out in the recent days. And we'll move on to examine a couple of Brexit scenarios and analyze the transition period, and then do an analysis of Brexit impact on the UK economy as a whole. And we'll then move on to industry-specific analysis of Brexit and its impact, very importantly starting with the automotive industry, and then moving on to financial services, and finally ending with the healthcare industry. And at the end of the session, we'll also have a Q&A session. So with that, we'll get right into it. Moving on to the next slide, which is the timeline slide. So we put this slide together to give you a better idea of what Brexit could look like over the next couple of months and days, even more importantly. So as we know, the Brexit vote was triggered back in June of 2016, and now it's been a little over 2 years since the vote has taken place. Months and months of negotiations, as we all know. And the last 2 weeks, more importantly, have been very important in the sense that we've seen a lot of concrete developments coming up with the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration being published. And it was just last Sunday that the EU endorsed this particular political declaration and withdrawal agreement. Now, just a quick summary of what these two documents entail. The withdrawal agreement focuses on aspects such as citizens' rights, the transition period, the financial settlement, and we'll go into it in the next slide. Now, this is a legally binding document, so no changes expected. The political declaration is a much shorter document and most importantly talks about the future trade relationship between the UK and the EU. This is not a legally binding document at this stage, and most of this is only expected to be finalized or formalized during the transition period. So the key dates that we're all looking towards, as you can see outlined in the green box, is on the 11th of December, when the UK Parliament is expected to vote on both the withdrawal agreement as well as the political declaration. Now, as we would all know, this could prove to be quite a tricky stage because there is criticism coming from the Prime Minister's own Conservative Party as well as opposition parties. So it remains to be seen as to whether this vote would go through. So there are essentially two scenarios that could come out. There could be a yes vote or a no vote. So looking more closely at the no vote, this would obviously throw the UK into quite a bit of turmoil in the sense that the government would have 21 days to draw up a new plan as to what things could look like. And there are several scenarios that could unfold in terms that the UK could possibly renegotiate the terms of the deal with EU, or it could be a no-deal scenario that unfolds. And even based on live news feeds that we're receiving, we understand that if it's a no vote, the UK is expected to drastically step up its no-deal planning. Similarly, there could possibly be a second referendum, and there's even a provision to, in fact, extend the UK-EU negotiations much beyond March of 2019, that is Brexit Day. But the EU has to agree to the same. And there could also be a no confidence vote or a leadership vote. So a whole lot of scenarios that could throw up, and a lot of risks and instability that persists. Now, if the vote does go through, then an EU withdrawal bill could be introduced. This could be in the first time of voting, or perhaps when it goes through on the second time. And following this, the European parliamentary ratification is required, and this is expected to take place sometime in Feb or March of 2019. And if all goes well, UK is set to leave the EU on March 29th of 2019, that's Brexit Day. And more importantly, a transition phase would set in from March 29th, 2019, right up till December 31st of 2020. So that's a 21-month period during which a transition phase would take place. Moving on to the next slide. So we've analyzed the withdrawal agreement and explored some of its key aspects for the benefit of all those attending today. So with respect to the transition period, now this particular transition period, the terms of it were agreed back in March, and what's been finalized in the last 2 weeks is pretty much same and similar to what was finalized back in March. Apart from the fact that there's an extension, a provision to now extend the transition. So it might not just be a 21-month transition period. Should the UK and the EU agree, it could possibly be extended beyond this time, perhaps for an undecided time. Now, the EU has expressed interest of potentially increasing this to 2022, and Theresa May has given indications of a shorter transition period. So there is a provision to extend this period, but if this is to be done, the decision has to be taken by mid of next year. Now, with respect to the trade agreement per se, now we've all heard a lot of scenarios that have been discussed in the past couple of months, such as the Canada scenario and the Czechia scenario. So the type of trade agreement that is expected to be finally formalized post-transition. During the transition, things will stay as is, in the sense that UK will still remain part of the EU single market and customs union, so no changes in trade conditions. But after the transition period, that particular agreement or the nature of that particular deal is still to be finalized, and most of these talks will take place during the transition period. It hasn't been finalized as yet. Now, with respect to citizens' rights, again, a lot of it that was finalized is very similar to what was released back in March. And we understand that EU citizens can continue to move to the UK during the transition period and can continue to stay even after the transition period ends. And when they attain a 5-year mark of living in the UK, they can apply for permanent residence, or something known as settled status. So this gives a lot more certainty with regards to the status of EU citizens, and we've in fact seen a drop in immigration to the UK in the past couple of months. But we expect that with this certainty, there could be a pickup in EU immigration to the UK during the transition period. Now, moving on to the financial settlement amounts that the UK has to pay to the EU. The withdrawal agreement doesn't state a figure per se, but it's expected to be in the range of about £39 billion that are expected to be paid over the next couple of years. Now, the criticism of the same is that the question as to why the UK would have to pay into the EU budget without having worked out a trade agreement, with the still lingering risk that the trade agreement could be quite poor for the UK. So this is one of the criticisms that's been raised with regards to the financial settlement. And lastly, we have the Northern Ireland backstop or the Irish border backstop. So the UK has been working very hard to ensure that there is no hard border coming up between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. And what has been worked out as part of the withdrawal agreement is that the UK and EU would form part of a single customs territory. It would sort of be like a customs union, but Northern Ireland would be much more closely aligned with the EU when it comes to rules and regulations. And some level of checks are expected between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Now, the reservations against this particular model, firstly, is that UK can't unilaterally decide to leave the backstop. Now, this particular backstop is sort of like an insurance policy, so to speak. So after the transition period ends on December 2020, should a trade deal not be in place by then, that's when this particular backstop would get activated. If, technological solutions or other solutions to solve the Irish border problem haven't been figured out by then, this sort of backstop would come into place. So UK can't unilaterally leave the backstop. It has to have the consent of the EU as well, and this is one contention against this particular model. And another key one is the fact that it could potentially restrict the UK's ability to strike trade deals with the world. As we all know, one potential benefit of leaving the Brexit that UK has constantly expressed is that it would be able to strike trade deals with new trade partners. And even with respect to the question of whether it can, there was recent news with regards to the US questioning whether UK could actually engage in a trade deal with the US. Now, from what we understand, during the transition period, the UK can start negotiating trade deals, be it with the US or other countries outside of the EU. These trade deals can't come into force until it leaves the transition. Now, suppose it has to leave the transition and the Irish border hasn't been solved, then the backstop would come into force. And when the backstop comes into force, UK would be required to apply the EU's common external tariff with all its trade partners. So essentially what happens is it can't sort of reduce or minimalize tariffs for, let's say, the US or countries that it wants to engage in free trade with. So it's not that the UK cannot strike trade deals, because the withdrawal agreement clearly specifies that the UK will have an independent trade policy. It's just that it could be delayed. The actual enforcement of the trade deals could be delayed until the backstop problem is resolved. So moving on to the next slide, just a quick assessment of the transition period impact, because this is the period that businesses will be entering for about 21 months starting March of 2019. We've already covered this point on citizens' rights. Now, moving on to single market and customs union, as most of you would well know, the UK is expected to remain part of the EU single market and customs union during the transition period. Quite simply put, this means that no new tariffs, no new customs checks between the UK and the EU during this transition period. So trade and supply chains wouldn't get affected during this period. And trade deals, which we've already discussed, the UK can start to engage in these deals, but not enforce them at the moment. So these particular factors are a plus for the UK. Now moving on to the more riskier factors, the Northern Ireland agreement we've already discussed, and decision making. This is a key point in the sense that the UK will remain part of the EU single market, but will not have any say with regards to EU decision making on single market rules or any other EU decision making processes. And this is seen as a downside in the sense that the UK would have to continue adhering to EU rules, continue to pay into the EU budget without any voice whatsoever with regards to the decision making process per se. So it would essentially become a rule taker and not a rule maker. Moving on to the next slide. So we've analyzed a couple of Brexit scenarios that are likely to unfold. The first and most important being the no deal scenario. So a quick summary of what this scenario would entail and why it would have a damaging impact on growth, as we all know. So the most important, as you can see from the first bullet on the left, is that the no deal scenario completely rules out a transition period. So if the parliament votes no, and if, let's say in the next couple of weeks, a no deal scenario pans out, then starting March 2019, 29th of 2019, there would be no transition phase whatever. UK would immediately crash out of the EU, and EU's import tariffs would be exposed on the UK, and UK would have to come up with its own set of tariffs, and there would be a whole host of customs checks, and the Irish border problem would also come into play. So it's quite a problematic scenario, the no deal scenario. The next one that we've looked at is the CETA or the Canada type scenario. We see this as quite a likely scenario in the sense that this is the CETA type trade agreement is the agreement that the EU has finalized with Canada. So since this is something that's already in force with the non-EU country, it's something that the EU could potentially approve when it comes to the UK. Maybe not necessarily Canada or CETA as is, maybe a CETA plus version or a CETA merged with some other model, but some of these aspects. So what does CETA essentially entail? It's just important to remember that under CETA, trade in goods is quite frictionless. So industrial goods don't carry tariffs. But however, there are customs checks under a CETA type model. And customs checks is something that businesses in the UK are quite wary of, especially those that rely on just-in-time manufacturing, because the whole supply chain would be affected. And as you would all know, when we did our analysis a couple of months back, and we've been routinely updating the same, there was also the much talked about the checker scenario that was finalized a couple of months back. But we don't necessarily see the scenario playing out too much right now, firstly because the EU has rejected the same. And also the checkers type scenario called for free trade in goods, but with a common rule book with the EU on goods. But as per the recent political declaration, it says that the UK and the EU would have separate legal laws. So this aspect of a common rule book wouldn't be workable, which is why we don't see checkers as being too likely an option right now. So just a quick summary, if the no deal scenario were to come into play, there would be no transition period. The trade agreement could be a CETA type model or a completely novel model that the UK and EU come out. Businesses would really have to wait until 2020 to see what this particular trade model would look like. Now, with regards to the Brexit impact on the UK economy, we've analyzed top-level factors such as economic growth and interest rates and immigration. So this particular slide analyzes the UK's projected growth trajectory. So this line that you see in red is the expected growth in a no-deal scenario. As you can see, it's going pretty much into the negative territory. And while growth is expected to slip, we don't expect the UK to be in a recession for more than 2 years. If you pull back data for about 20 to 30 years, any time UK's growth slipped into the negative territory, it recovered in about 2 years. Even if you look back to the 2008 financial crisis, it was just for 2 years, and the GDP growth figures were almost similar to these levels. Now, under a CETA-style deal, we expect growth to slip because there would be customs checks and there would be some restraints, but obviously it wouldn't fall into the negative territory. But the growth trajectory based on the trade deal, it really depends on the terms of the trade deal that are worked out. For example, if it's complete frictionless trade in goods, it would be much higher growth, whereas if it's restricted and if there are customs checks, it will be much lesser growth. So it really depends on the terms of the trade deal that are worked out. With respect to monetary conditions in terms of what sort of business interest rates companies could expect, so as we know, the Bank of England pursued a rate hike back in August of 2018, and rates have been held steady since. What we expect is that if all goes well and if a transition period is imposed and things are smooth, the interest rate will continue to tighten in 2019. We expect the rates only to be hiked after sometime closer to when UK leaves the EU. But if it's a no-deal scenario, rates are definitely expected to be cut, similar to what happened closer to the time of, following the time of the referendum, when interest rate cuts were pursued to strengthen the economy. And the scale of cuts could be much higher here. So businesses could expect rate cuts under a no-deal scenario, but continued monetary policy tightening that's been going on from about 2017, if all goes well and a transition period comes into play. And finally, with respect to migration, so this particular chart that you see here on your left, the brown line on the top is indicative of non-EU net migration, with the lighter blue line being indicative of EU net migration. And as you can see, right after the Brexit vote back in 2016, there was a sharp drop in EU net migration to the UK. And what we expect, you see two lines, two trajectories for the lines. So the light blue line, for a CETA style scenario, there's expected to be an uptick in migration during the transition period because of the certainty of citizens' rights, and we expect UK employers to hire more EU citizens during this particular period because of the certainty. So there's going to be an uptick right up till 2020. Thereafter, your free movement is expected to end, so net migration would fall. Now, the extent of this fall is really quite dependent on the migration policy that's formulated by the government. What we understand from the political declaration, for example, is that free movement will definitely end after the transition period, with maybe short travel without the requirement for visas. Now, it remains to be seen whether longer stays would be allowed without requirements for visas, or whether there could be some special treatment for highly skilled EU workers. If so, obviously the drop in migration would be a lot lesser. And under the no-deal scenario, as you can see, if Parliament votes no and the UK crashes out of the EU without a deal, migration is expected to continue to dip as it has been in the past couple of months, and this is expected to continue over the foreseeable months. With that, we've come to the end of the economic analysis on Brexit, and I'd like to invite Kevin Kelly, who would now shed some light on the Brexit impact on the automotive industry.
Okay, thank you very much, Nia, for that introduction to Brexit and the economic impact. So I'd like to take us on to the automotive sector, which is one of the main industrial drivers in the UK, and is very likely to be impacted regardless of the type of EU Brexit negotiation policy. So let's get into this a little bit. So as Nia mentioned, there's a couple of scenarios that we at Frost have done, the no-deal scenario and the CETA scenario. And what I wanted to do here on this slide is show some key influencing factors on the automotive industry. So we have the certification challenge, the customs delay challenge, the rules on origins of parts and tariffs from non-EU countries, and the higher potential cost of trade with the EU. And these four potential factors or challenges to the automotive industry we've analysed based on a no-deal scenario and a CETA scenario. And the big thing here is the no-deal scenario has huge implications to the automotive industry. From a regulatory point of view, would the certification policy for EU manufactured vehicles allow export to Europe? So currently this has not been confirmed. So at the moment the VCA certificate in the UK would not be valid for exporting cars to the EU, which would add additional cost and complexity to the manufacturing process. With the CETA scenario, this gives the OEMs, manufacturers and suppliers significantly more time due to the transition period to iron out these issues and understand from a regulatory perspective what will happen to VCA certification. Within the customs delay, for no deal, there would be significant changes to the customs importation system, and there would be a longer delay for imports, customs and checks, with the no deal being a possibility from next year. This is a very short period of time for OEMs to have this huge challenge put into their supply chain. From the CETA side, again, it's going back to this reflective process of more time for the OEM suppliers to put measures in place to implement after December 2020. So we also have the non-EU country tariff reduction. So at the moment, with approximately 25% of local content in the UK, it comes from the UK in its manufacturing process. And this would have a big impact on the UK exports, as they would not get preferential, 75% would not get preferential tariffs, so significantly increase the cost of the vehicles. With the CETA, there is no change to this impact from after December 2020, so it would only give the additional period in the transition period. There would also be significant possible tariffs implemented if we had a no deal. If we had a no deal, there would be significant tariffs onto the vehicles within Europe, and this would have a huge impact to the costs. With the tariffs under CETA, industrial goods, as Nea mentioned, they have a reduction, but this would still have some cost implication. So if we move on to how do these challenges impact the sales volume within the UK? Oh, sorry, I'm just seeing there was some audio poor. So I apologise, I'm trying to speak up as much as I can, but apologies if you cannot hear. So what we're doing here is we're looking at how all of these macro situations impact on the new car sales, depending on the Brexit deal. So the green line here is a forecast based on if Brexit did not happen, and you could see there would still be a continued growth of the total industry volume. Obviously, with the scenarios we have now, we are now in a CETA or soft Brexit type situation, or a no deal situation. Both of these situations would cause decline in sales forecasts, as consumers would be unsure of many situations, not just vehicle purchasing, but also financial, or as Nia said, other impacts. But we believe this could be recovered within a 2 to 3 year period. So we see this sharp decline in 2018 and 2019, but we see there could be a plateauing or recovery based on the situation post 2021. So we do see that the industry is able to recover in terms of new car sales. If we move on to seeing what this impact would have on production. So obviously the UK has many OEMs who manufacture components and vehicles in the UK, so not only sales is an influencing factor, but a significant amount of this is exported production. So what would be the impact on production? And we see here with this graph, this is the no Brexit scenario. There is a significant reduction in vehicle production within the UK. And this is seen within 2018 and 2019. And this is already starting to influence the decision making of OEMs. So we're starting to see announcements from the like of Jaguar Land Rover, who have started doing part-time production, or BMW, who are stockpiling components to ensure manufacturing continuity. And along with this, the UK automotive industry has a huge amount of employees, so 186,000 approximately within 2017, with approximately 10% of this number of people coming from EU countries, which would have a large influence on how OEMs can hire people in certain positions, not just in manufacturing, but also in engineering and research and R&D, which will also be heavily impacted in terms of employability. So the companies will not only have a tariff or production issue, a supply issue, but they also may have a staffing issue. And all of these influencing factors could increase manufacturing costs by approximately £2,500 per car for a UK car being exported to another market, to a European market. This would have a significant impact on the profitability and competitiveness of many companies, and we'll come on to some of the mitigating factors OEMs are introducing later. So if we look at the production is not just one metric to be able to understand what's happening in the automotive industry. The other one is investment. So this investment is being dramatically impacted by Brexit, and we're seeing two disruptions in investment for automotive OEMs and suppliers. One is Brexit itself, the uncertainty, the continuity and which level of tariff will be applied is having huge reductions in the amount of investments they want to make to ensure they can maintain supply after Brexit. The second is digitization. So we see, going back even 2015 to 2016, we see investment was on the decline. And this investment decline was due to the improvement in digitization of the industry, both in terms of R&D and manufacturing process. So this decline had started before Brexit, but as Brexit happened, or the announcements that the UK would leave the EU, this comes in 2016, 2017, and we've seen a sharp reduction. And if we go with this no deal situation, no Brexit deal situation, we see a dramatic decline down to 400 million from 1.1 billion in 2017. And as I say, this is twofold, not only Brexit but also digitization. So we may see lots of suppliers or companies and OEMs moving further into this digitization field, and we view this field as being approximately worth 74 billion by 2035. So this is Brexit is driving more investment in this digital field. And the OEM industry, or the automotive industry in the UK, is not just manufacturers, not just the people who build the components, the suppliers and the OEMs, but is also the service industry. And the service industry contributes 12.2 billion to the UK economy, so is also a significantly impacted version of this. And obviously this is very relevant to not only car park, number of cars in the car park, but also the number of car sales, and how this has an impact on components, and how it has an impact on customer behavior in terms of purchasing and servicing, and how they change their customer behavior. So we see this currently employs approximately 345,000 employees within this sector, and this will also be impacted as we go forward in Brexit. So we see each of the automotive value chain being impacted by a Brexit deal. Whether this is no Brexit or CETA, there will be impacts not only in tariffs, but in time for the components to come. So if we think of a scenario where a customer has had a faulty component on their car, where will this component come from? What will happen within that dealership? How do they order? What tariffs will be on these service components, not just production components? And how does this influence the whole, not only value chain, but customer experience of a vehicle? And I would like to come on to the next bit here, is the real numbers behind this aftermarket situation. So we see significant increase in parts pricing, and also a lack of clarity from the parts suppliers on how many parts are available, when those parts are available, and how fast to get those. So we'll see this coming in the consumer impact, where we view there could be a decrease of 11% in customer spending on car maintenance. We also see this being influenced on the terms of how long customers keep their cars, and the higher pricing that people pay for servicing parts component, both in aftermarket and direct from the OEMs. And this could possibly lead to a 30% reduction in investment in the aftermarket system, and up to 35,000 reduction in employment in the aftermarket sector itself. And a little bit earlier on I mentioned we talked about OEM mitigating factors, and this is one point I wanted to go over quite extensively today. So we have here three key European key OEMs in the UK automotive manufacturing. So we have BMW, who manufacture Mini in Oxford plant, approximately 218,000 vehicles. And the key thing for this is 80% of these are exported. This is similar statistic for Jaguar Land Rover and Honda, who all export a significant number of their cars. So this will lead to these OEMs having to have a huge priority in understanding the Brexit deal, the impact to them, and also planning for the possibility of a no Brexit deal. Obviously, Nea mentioned earlier on, in the last couple of weeks and last few days, we have had significant movement on understanding the type of Brexit deal we will have. But this still does not remove the uncertainty of a no Brexit deal, which all OEMs are currently using as their benchmark to understand how do they continue production, how do they supply parts outside, and how do they supply fully fitted vehicles out to Europe, and what will be the impact on their business. So if we look at some of the post-Brexit strategies, so if we start with BMW, there's a strong possibility from them that they could shift dramatically to EVs within their Mini brand, which they have already announced some shift towards this way, in the look for trying to get both incentives from the UK government, who are trying to establish the UK as a manufacturing expertise for EV vehicles, but also try and get some EU grants or reduce tariffs on EV vehicles because of the CAFE compliance regulations within the EU. They could also shift production parts or even full vehicles from other regions such as the USA or Canada or other non-EU countries in terms of trying to reduce the impact on their supply chain. From Jaguar Land Rover, they have a slightly different tactic where they have a possible European manufacturing location in Slovakia, which has just recently opened for their Discovery brand, but it has significant capacity to be increased. And they also have looked at developing partnerships to reduce their reliance on imported components. This was a pre-Brexit discussions with Magna investments, but we could see this type of partnership and this type of relationship dramatically increasing in a post-EU UK situation. Within Honda is a very different situation again because they have a very low manufacturing facility in the UK in terms of volume, so 122,000 units, which is a fifth near enough of the Jaguar Land Rover figures. So this is Honda's only European plant, but they couldn't relocate this due to expensive costs, but they could import from markets such as Canada, where they have production of two core models in the Civic and CR-V, and shift their UK manufacturing volume to being their UK sales volume. So trying to significantly increase the number of cars they manufacture and sell within the UK, and for EU models maybe shift this manufacturing to another market such as Canada. So we see here with these three examples, there's three distinct different ways, and there is other OEMs such as GM or PSA, the PSA who have the plant near Liverpool and in Luton, of how these different OEMs are doing different strategies to shift to mitigate the risks of a Brexit scenario, particularly a no-deal scenario. So we see here at the bottom the influence of import tax on different OEMs. So with the EU manufactured components to the UK, this has a huge impact on companies like Ford, Volkswagen, BMW, Mercedes-Benz and Audi, premium OEMs, who are manufacturing Europe and trying to sell significant volumes in the UK. So there is also their aspect of how do they understand the Brexit deal. And from the UK to the EU, as we mentioned, we have the three key ones there, BMW, JLR and Honda, but also Nissan and Toyota. How do they shift their volumes or move sales volumes from the UK to the EU? So each OEM is influenced in a different way and has different mitigating factors. But the key themes we're trying to see here is they will go outside the EU predominantly to try and get their components. And they will look at ways of trying to shift some of the EU volume to other locations as well. So this brings me to the end of my presentation on automotive. I hope this has been a good glimpse into the impacts of the automotive industry and how some OEMs are able to shift. And apologies if my audio has not been great. I'd like to pass over to Luca now to go through the financial services.
Thank you, Kevin. Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Luca Raffellini. I'm the head of financial services at Frost & Sullivan. I hope you can hear me well. The next 10, 12 minutes, we're going to talk about financial services. I should point out straight away that we are not going to cover specifically the whole financial system of the UK, although this is very important, particularly after the publication of the Bank of England stress test and the financial stability report. So questions on the broader financial stability are very welcome. We'll try to answer those as long as we recognize that these slides are really focused on financial services. The situation for a very large, complex industry like financials is, in fact, very simple. The withdrawal agreement, the 587 pages, are really made up of a very large part, the protocol, and a statement of intent for the future. The protocol says absolutely nothing about financial services. And in fact, the most important part of the protocol side, which really deals with the next couple of years, is the distinction that you see on this page. So the only really important distinction for financial services is whether there is no deal or we do in fact progress with the current withdrawal agreement. In the first case, all existing contractual arrangements with European countries and service financial players and consumers will come to an end. That includes, of course, the loss of passport rights. In reality, there has been an informal agreement between the European Union and the Treasury in the UK that existing contractual arrangements will be honoured until the natural life of the contract themselves. But leaving aside that this has not been enshrined in law yet, it is clearly a very minimal guarantee. If there is indeed an agreement of the CETA plus variety, then the interesting part is the first 21 months. In the first 25 months, in reality, nothing changes. The passport rights are retained, and so are the contracts. So UK and European service providers, financial service providers, will be able to trade as they have in the past. As for the future, again, the future is only a declaration of intent of 6 pages in the withdrawal agreement, and mention specifically financial services only in regard to the so-called equivalence regime. If we move to the next page, let's say a couple of things on what passporting and equivalence are. Equivalence may suggest a fairly nice, symmetrical, balanced relationship. In reality, equivalence is everything but. Equivalence is an existing contractual instrument that the European Union apply to third parties, to any countries that want to deal with the European Union on a financial service trading basis, can be granted equivalence. So equivalence is granted to a country by the European Union and can be withdrawn very quickly, within 30 days. It's also quite narrow in scope, so it needs to be granted for a particular segment of the financial services industries that typically exclude interesting ones like deposit or current accounts. Currently, we are at the opposite end of the scale. We have a passporting rights agreement, which means that at the moment any financial service player can register in its own country and have a passport. So this is not a country-to-country agreement, is a firm-to-country agreement, and that covers a large variety of financial services. And of course, it is a right. It is a right that arises from a firm being able to trade within the European Union. The mutual regulatory recognition is also an existing contractual instrument, but is not being used extensively, or indeed at all, by the European Union. It's presently in force, for instance, between Canada and the US. Is limited in scope and only academic in interest because it's already been essentially ruled out by both the UK and the European Union. As for the enhanced equivalence, that is of course possible, although is not specifically mentioned in the withdrawal agreement. If we move to the next page, what we're trying to do here very briefly, because the financial services industry is so large, is to take four very, very short case studies in four different areas of the financial industry. We have not tackled the big one, the one that has been talked about extensively, which is clearing. Derivative clearing accounts for 60 billion euro of business and has been at the center of most negotiation on financial services. It's obviously very important. All we can say is that at the moment there is a strong declaration of intent on both sides to have clearing continued, but no firm agreement in this sense. If we look at four individual cases, the general picture is that, as in many situations, there are winners and losers. In this case, it would seem that as far as financial services players is concerned, there are probably more losers than winners. If we look, for instance, at investment banks and some of their key activity on proprietary trading and underwriting, that will essentially require for them to set up subsidiaries in EU countries in which they want to trade. That in itself is not a problem. Most of them already have subsidiaries, particularly the large investment banks in other countries. There is, however, one span in the works, which is the European Banking Authority, which ironically used to be in London, has recently passed into legislation a ruling that they will need to decide on capital requirements. This may sound quite obscure, but essentially what it says is that if you are an investment bank currently housed in the UK, you cannot just open a postal address, a little office in Frankfurt. You need, and if you're trading 5 billion euro of derivatives from Frankfurt, you need to have the infrastructure, people, and capital requirement to back it up. So in essence, that implies a very heavy flow of capital and people to other European countries. For asset managers, is a similar situation. We've focused here on alternative investment, alternative assets like hedge funds and real estate. For them, the fundamental point is the jurisdiction issue. Again, very similar situation. Currently, most of these funds work on the delegation principle, whereby providing that you are addressed, you're housed in one of the European countries, you can invest in all the others. That will need to be verified based on those capital requirements. So for both investment banks and asset managers in general, is not good news. If we look at private equity, that's a much more interesting and exciting situation because it really depends on what the risk profile of your portfolio and your investment strategy is. Arguably, and it has been argued by certainly many of our clients, this is a situation that may present opportunities. Is the building on fire concept, the idea that that when there is a potentially distressed or unusual situation and the risk profile isn't clear, people they are able to move quickly, they have availability of funds, and perhaps the agility to invest may really see some good opportunities. Certainly, that would solve the problem which is really besetting the private equity industry, which is not so much custom arrangement, but is dry powder and multiples. So to the extent that that can be solved by some exceptionally good deal coming online, that could in fact be an opportunity, particularly for those private equity firms that are perhaps more focused on carved out, distressed, or even non-lending, even non-equity situation like mezzanine, etc. Finally, for fintech, situation is very simple. Fintech is an up-and-coming high-growth industry, very diversified. But if we look at the mainstay of fintech, which is really digital payment, the second generation startups, there is no particular hardware reason why they should move. But the reality is that if you look at the key success factors, one of the key success factors here is the critical access to human capital. And to the extent that London may become a less interesting, dare I say, less cool destination, and that we would almost certainly see a migration of some of these second-generation startups to other hubs like Berlin or Amsterdam or even, dare I say, Milan, which may be perceived as more interesting or cooler. This concludes the finance service section. As I said, questions on these or the broader financial stability and stress test are welcome as well. With that said, I pass the floor to the next speaker, Sujit.
Hi, good afternoon and good evening and good morning to people in different parts of the world. And thank you so much, Luca, for the wonderful presentation. My name is Sujit. I'm the Director for Consulting for Healthcare for Frost & Sullivan's Europe and Israel practice. And today we're going to talk about what's the impact of Brexit on the healthcare market. Traditionally, healthcare as an industry has been recession-proof with minor impacts on mostly around trade deals and associated taxes like in the United States and other parts of the world. Healthcare in UK is, I would say, the center point, and as David Cameron once said, as the crown jewel of the British market. That has, accounts for almost, in terms of 60 billion plus revenues, exports of over 30 billion. And to give you a context on what could be the impact or what does it mean for the UK and the industries in healthcare industries within the market, it employs almost 220,000 plus people, of which I would say this is only in the life sciences side. I'm not accounting people in NHS, of which almost 7% are only non-British. And almost what I would account for is 10% of the GDP budget is spent on the NHS. Now, what is interesting to note is that just pharma manufacturing in the United Kingdom will account for almost 213 billion, 30 billion odd to the gross value add figures. And this is a huge figure when we talk about the overall European market, where UK stands out just on the manufacturing scale for pharma products. And in addition to that is the UK market accounted for almost the highest FDI coming from both among European countries, which is when you compare that to the rest of the European countries, maybe Germany and France, fairly little bit, but investments flowing in from the US, from China, from India, from other parts of the world, especially the APAC region, especially Japanese markets, is huge in terms of foreign direct investment in the healthcare sector. This combined by the fact that UK is a massive R&D hub. Now, when we talking about R&D, UK has a huge research and R&D wing, which accounts almost 20% of the funding. This is huge when you compare it to global figures of global majors, who are spending only about 8 to 9% of their annual revenues on R&D. And when you consider 20% of UK has a 20% funding, it's a lot to say. Now, let's move to the key factors. There is also UK is a critical market when they call as a part of the industry where specialty drugs are either developed, is a major fluctuating point where NICE, the UK authority, is one of the most well-known established health technology assessment sectors and has a great influence on the global market. NICE alone does technology appraisals worth $325 billion of pricing for the global pharma market. So what we see in the next, what was expected that the UK market to grow on both life sciences and healthcare industries to grow about between the range of 5 to 8% in the next coming years. Yes, Brexit will have an impact on that. It will slow down. There is no doubt about it. And there will be a little bit of pressure, but this is expected to pick up on multiple levels in the coming days. Now, what would be the impact on multiple levels? There is an across while I've said what it means is what are the numbers, the landscape of the UK market, there is a critical element here. There is almost 45 million of, packs of drugs are exported by the UK. At the same time, about 37 million are imported as well. Now, it could be that there will be significant amount of delays, depending on the type of deal that the Parliament approves or does not approve, where there could be delays in supply of drugs which are entering into the market. There could be delays which will impact, the drugs going out. So especially, for example, insulin, the government has indicated to NHS to create sufficient supply and create enough backup quantities of insulin for the market because it's a huge diabetes market. There could be a rise, considering that if we have a Canada-style CETA type of deal, it could mean duty-free and everything is fine and it could be all hunky-dory. We may lose access to some of the free trade agreements which EU already has with some of these markets, including Israel and Korea and other parts of the world. So that's one aspect of the impact. There could be impact on supply chain and being again, as I said, if UK accounts for 213 billion of the manufacturing gross value add, it could face increasing lead times, customs checks, impact on supply chain, impact on QA/QC checks, batch testing, as companies would be forced to then hold sufficient amount of stock during the transition period, as Neha had indicated earlier in the part of her discussion as well. And that transition period and what that will entail is something which I think if the current deal is there in place, if approved, we think that this would be fairly straightforward. If not, there will be these customs checks that are in place for the UK market. Now, other aspect is the regulatory aspect, which is also a critical element. Now, historically, UK has been a critical player in devising the regulatory approvals, and the FDA actually, funnily enough, stated that the new European Pharma Clinical Trials Directive is like a gift to the United States because they're going to follow that to the T. And newer regulations are going to come in place effective to 2018 from the new EU directive. Now, what does that mean? As a part of that is that European Medicine Agency also sits in in the London, United Kingdom, and it will have one aspect about what will have an impact is going to Amsterdam. Now, Theresa May, in one of her statements, did make that UK could have an associate partnership with the European Medicines Agency. But what is also critical to note that in the past, first MHRA being there, used to have a critical influence on the European Medicines Agency. MHRA accounted for almost 30% of the testing being done by European Medicine Agency, but that has changed ever since the vote for exiting the European Union happened. Apparently, last year only about two particular deals have gone to MHRA for testing activities as well. So it says a lot that if they move to Amsterdam, UK will not have the same level of influence that on European directives in the future. But if we become an associate, it would be much more straightforward and simpler processes for unlike pharma companies would not have twin approvals both for UK and the EU separately, and this would have a lower impact in total as such. Moving on to the other aspect is, of course, the supply chain aspect, which we've already discussed, and additionally the patent. Patent is a very important aspect within the UK-EU conundrum, where overhauling I think the last couple of years there has been a serious overhaul of the patent regime in EU. There used to be a pan-EU unitary patent covering deal which was in place. This is not going to impact UK's exit as much. I doubt it, and as an organization, we do doubt it, as a unified patent court agreement might be adopted by the UK as an associate of the EU, if depending on the CETA deal that has been going. But however, there has been a urge among the industries that how they should be dealing with patent protection. There is supplementary protection certificates which also be in place especially for patents for medicinal and plant-based products, which have obtained authorizations in the EU as well. So this would also mean a significant amount of impact in the future. Now, moving on to the next element is what is interesting is that the last couple of years, especially ever since the Brexit deal has gone through, what has also impacted is that certain local organizations like GSK, Merck Sharp and Dohme are also started to heavily invest in the UK market. GSK is committed almost 275 million on a couple of new manufacturing sites. AstraZeneca has also pumped in almost 330 million in the new R&D centers. Similarly, Merck Sharp and Dohme has a new partnership with Manchester Innovation Council, and QIAGEN has also started to heavily invest in the UK market. So it's, despite knowing there is a positive approach to the UK healthcare industry and the life sciences industry by some of these global tier 1 players, which is still to indicate that the market will continue to be a positive space for investment in the future. The other aspect is the brain drain, which is potentially likely to happen. Now, when I say brain drain, it is not just in the healthcare and life sciences aspect, it's both in the services side as well as on the manufacturing and R&D elements. Now, what is interesting to note that in every research, be it European research or UK-driven research, if there are 3 people in the research element, there will be at least one UK partner or more, or similarly for the EU side of the business, where there is a research paper there is at least one UK partner. Now, what we think is based on if there is a CETA type of deal, what will happen is most of these research will get impacted, especially research funding flowing in from the EU. UK accounted for almost 8.8 billion of the research happening. Funds coming from European Union, but there has been a similar amount which is flown out of the UK as well. So that could be a huge impact on the R&D funding coming through. But at the same time, also if the new visa regulations are impacted, it could also mean employing people from the European Union would be a challenge. But we think that as a part of the new visa regulations, there would be either short-term contracts would be in place, short-term visas would enable some of these R&D folks to work in the UK, or there could be specialized visas which are in place, which has very limited impact on that research. At the same time, NHS will face a severe staffing shortage. What is interesting to note that as of, say, 2017, almost 130,000 jobs vacant, 133,000 jobs are vacant in the NHS, and this is a critical shortage. And what does that shortage of staff mean? Nurse shortage just alone has an impact of almost 2.4 billion pounds on the NHS, because that means agency contracts, free, short-term contracts with nurses from other, etc., would have to be in place. Now, it also has an impact on manufacturing industry. It has an impact on sales and marketing staff within pharma and life sciences industry as well, and especially also a huge impact on the elderly care market in the United Kingdom. So I think this particular slide, I just wanted to set the scene for what we're talking about. I would like to move on to the next slide, which is now looking and focusing on some of the so what's and what are the impacts on depending on the type of deal. One, say, is the workforce. Now, EU staff recruitment and retention. Now, what we see, if we see that if the current agreement allows the existing European staff to continue working without, and there's not going to be much of an impact. But there is going to be a much more skills assessment, and the impact when on a CETA type of deal is going to be positive, and it'll continue to work. But it will also mean that there might be a better visa system for skilled labor from other parts of the world, which is right now UK market or UK border agencies quite restricted for non-EU workers. That might open up a floodgates from researchers and people from other parts of the world, including China and Korea, which could also mean that the staff shortages could be fulfilled by that. Now, in the past, financing, especially of healthcare, from a services standpoint, there was free movement, and obtaining healthcare from other parts of the European Union for UK citizens and vice versa was free movement. But depending on the upcoming deal, it could be that UK could either adopt a European insurance system where there could be vice versa contracts in place. That's a potential opportunity for the NHS to possibly gather some funds as well for treating European citizens. But that's still, again, depending on the deal, but a CETA type of deal will have a very limited impact on that as well. Market approval, as I discussed before, again, so access to, if we are becoming an associate member of the European Medicines Agency, it could be, it will have a very limited impact depending on the CETA type of deal. Service delivery, I think the biggest impact will be on the social care sector, as I mentioned, elderly care, because there's been exodus in the last couple of years. And this will be one critical area where either staffing it up and building staff in the next couple of years towards the post-transition period will become a key priority for the UK, both the social care sector and managing agencies accordingly. Of course, if I can move on to the next slide, there is also, in order to employ, there is a need for recognition of professional qualifications. UK is one country which is particularly strict on recognizing professionals from other parts of the world. So if there is a need to fulfill the skills shortage, at the same time deliver quality care, they have to tighten up the regulations with regards to the qualifications. As, again, market authorization, I know that a lot of pharma companies are preparing for individual UK market authorization and the EU market authorization. But if being an associate member could be a possibility that could be made easier. However, what we also predict is that, like the FDA is creating an accelerated review, UK MHRA would create an accelerated review process, and new and innovative drugs and tools can easily access the UK market. So if there are innovative tools and drugs coming from China to South Korea, that also would have an opportunity in the UK market as well in the future. Finished products, and it could mean that if there is a free trade agreement like CETA, it could also mean that it's still the same. However, if in the event of the UK falling under the WTO pharmaceutical agreement, that could be no duty for the finished products. However, for manufacturing, it could be in fact as importing of some APIs and other associated ingredients could mean a bigger impact. Now, what is also interesting is that the UK reference network will also bring together highly specialized centers for treatment areas, especially in the area of oncology and neurological disorders. And UK already has 33 hospitals participating in 22 of the 24 of those networks. In the past, EU had a strong regulatory structure designed to prevent states from implementing policies which are anti-competition. It is an opportunity for the NHS to break free from the EU legislation and to promote competition as well as a part of the impact. I'll move on to the next slide, where we're also just referring to the life sciences industry. It's quite similar to in terms of the impact. As I said, I've highlighted in the past before as well, is that yes, there will be impact on research, R&D, and other stuff. But if there is, especially for EU staff members, if there is a much more unique visa system or free working agreements which are in place, this does have very limited impact in the future. Yes, there will be a huge impact on ERP funding. As I said before, almost 8.8 billion will not come in through, but UK will still be an attractive market for venture capitalists and other forms of funding as well. So minimum impact during the transition period in the first 2 or 3 years, but I think after that we are expecting the spot financing to pick up for across R&D, etc. Manufacturing, again, subject to the trade agreement. If there is a CETA type, there is no customs fee for finished products, and medicinal quality, if you're following the EMEA, that will remain the same. However, in terms of if there is no deal Brexit and the Parliament doesn't pass the current deal, that would have a huge impact on the manufacturing and supply chain, as indicated before. I think in the coming years, there will be a minor impact on the R&D funding. If I move on to the next slide, where UK funding from EU will be reduced, but as highlighted before, some of the big majors are continuing to invest in the UK market and areas of R&D. So there will be a moderate impact for the immediate time. However, in the next coming years, it is bound to pick up. Investments will continue to grow, as indicated in the slide, where likes of Merck Sharp and Dohme and QIAGEN, etc., are investing in the UK market. It is also an opportunity for branded generics in the EU market as well, where generics from from other parts of the world will also have a greater impact, unless we are following a EU-style model where they have limited access. So with that, I would like to conclude my presentation and pass this floor to Anna. But however, I would like to be glad to take up any questions coming from the audience as well.
Thank you very much, Sujit. And due to our time, we have about less than a minute left. I see that there's many questions. So the team will take that offline and answer your questions. And for those that have joined us late, the on-demand recording will be available shortly after we finish, so you can listen to the entire presentation. We want to thank Neha, Kevin, Luca, and again, Sujit for their presentations. And we also invite you to provide any feedback under the Rate This tab. Any feedback, comments, or suggestions You can also follow us on our social media sites, Facebook and LinkedIn, to keep up to date on upcoming GIL events and also webinars and press releases and reports. So this is going to conclude today's webinar. If you do, again, have any interest in engaging in our growth strategy dialogue with one of our experts or learning more about Frost & Sullivan research, you can please contact Vignesh, and his details are listed on your screen at this time. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of your day.